released 4 more Israeli hostages. All of them are female Israeli soldiers. They've been handed over to the Red Cross in a public showcase in the heart of the enclave. Soon after their release, buses carrying 200 Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails started to cross into the West Bank. It marks the second hostage prisoner swap since the truce deal began. The agreement now faces a test as Israel's military accused Hamas of breaking its terms for not releasing a female civilian hostage. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that Palestinians will not be allowed to return to the north until the issue is resolved. Well, let's revisit the terms of the Gaza ceasefire deal. The 3-stage plan will see an initial 60-day truce, during which the first of 33 Israeli hostages will be released, consisting of children, women, men over 50, plus the injured and the sick. On the 16th day, negotiations will begin for a second phase to secure the release of all remaining captives. This includes soldiers, younger civilian men, plus the remains of hostages who have died. In exchange for the hostages, Israel says it will release hundreds of Palestinian prisoners at set intervals. And then Israel says it will begin a phased withdrawal from the enclave, which will only be completed when all hostages have been returned. Israel will maintain its military presence along the border, and there will be security arrangements at the Philadelphia corridor. That's the narrow buffer zone bordering Egypt. Let's talk to our correspondent Jonathan Regev, who joins us now live from Tel Aviv. Jonathan, what is the mood like there?
So the mood in Israel is one of joy and happiness on one thing and concern on the other. Joy and happiness, I think, is quite understandable. We're speaking of 4 women hostages who came back today, and when we add this to the other 3, which came back on Sunday, we're speaking of 7 hostages, female hostages, who came back to Israel just in the past week. So obviously a lot of happiness, and not only did they come back, but they all came back seemingly all in a good condition, on their feet, and that is, of course, source of happiness. Concern, because you don't really know what comes next, and this breach that Israel is speaking about comes from the fact that women civilians were meant to be released before the women soldiers, and currently there are still 2 women civilians in captivity. One of them is said to be alive and might be released as early as next Saturday. The other one is not exactly clear. We're speaking of a woman who's been kidnapped with her 2 children. If she's not on the list and she did not come back with all the rest of the civilians and the women started coming back, what does that mean? We do know that some of the people in this list of 33 hostages are not alive. What does that mean? Therefore, there's a lot of concern regarding that. And also, let's remember, and you mentioned that as well, Israel is paying a very heavy price to bring the hostages back. Today, 200 Palestinian prisoners were freed from Israeli prisons, 50 prisoners for each soldier that was freed. And not only that, out of those 50 prisoners released for each soldier, 30 are prisoners serving life sentences, many of them convicted for murdering many Israelis. And while some families are getting their loved ones back from Gaza, others are seeing the people that killed their loved ones being released from jail, even though they were meant to sit in jail for the rest of their lives. Therefore, it's quite a mutual feeling of happiness on one hand, concern on the other. And let's remember, with all the happiness of seeing 4 more hostages coming back home today, there are still 90 hostages in Gaza. For 26 of them, there is a route or a path for them to come back. We're speaking of those who are meant to be released during the first phase of the ceasefire. But what about the second stage? 64 hostages are meant to be released in that second stage, mostly the young men, but the terms of that second stage have not even been discussed yet. It is unclear if, when, how, where it will happen. Therefore, there's a lot of concern. One of the fathers of the hostages who came back today said it clearly. He said, of course I'm happy because my daughter is back, but my happiness is far from being complete, because 90 hostages are still in Gaza. Until all of them come back, the Israeli society will have a very difficult time recuperating. So these 4 hostages coming back today are clearly a step, but a small step. Many more steps have to happen before this is all over.
Yes, indeed. Jonathan, thank you very much for that. Jonathan Regev reporting there from Tel Aviv. Well, let's cross over now to Gaza and our correspondent there, Rami Al-Maghari. Rami, how are people feeling there?
Yes, actually, what we have seen today in Gaza is crowds of people, of displaced ones, have been waiting since the early morning or since yesterday night on the coastal road west of Nusayrat refugee camp in central Gaza Strip, the road that leads to Gaza city. They will walk down about 5 to 7 kilometers until they reach Gaza city and parts of the Gaza Strip, northern Gaza Strip. These crowds of people have been waiting and eager to reach their destinations, from which they have been deprived of actually for the past 15 months. This is a remarkable moment for this population. About more than 1 million Palestinians have been displaced since the war has broken out in October of 2023, and they are waiting to cross tomorrow morning. As stated, there are reports that the Israeli government will allow them to return back after they had assurances that two civilian women who have not been released today will be released next week. This is also goes with the release of 17 Palestinian prisoners from the Gaza Strip who arrived at their homes in Gaza today. A number of them have been sentenced to multiple life sentences in Israeli jails. One of them has been sentenced to 45 times a life sentence, and he was released. He and his wife expressed joy to CGTN when we were able to talk to them. This is a good moment for Palestinians in Gaza, that they are being eventually relieved out of the war that has been devastating at many levels for the population here. We are waiting tomorrow for these people to start crossing, to start walking down on the coastal road in their route back to the Gaza City or northern parts of the Gaza Strip. That's the situation for the moment. And we would like to refer also to the number of prisoners released by Israel. 200 of them were supposed to be released. 70 of them will be exiled outside of the Palestinian territories. As I said, 17 arrived at their homes, back at their homes in the Gaza Strip. And the others are from Jerusalem and West Bank.
Rami, thank you very much indeed for that. That's Rami Al-Maghari, our correspondent in Gaza. The United Nations has outlined the 4 transformational themes of development in 2025: women, money, artificial intelligence and peace. My colleague Juliette Mann sat down with Achim Steiner, the administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, and asked how those were chosen.
Because they're emblematic for some of the greatest challenges we face at the moment. We still live in a world of great inequality, and particularly also between men and women, not being paid the same for the jobs they do, access to the kind of infrastructure that allows you to be a successful entrepreneur. Peace, on the other hand, because we live in a moment in time where we have more conflicts and more displaced people, whether refugees or internally displaced people, than at any point since 1945. Artificial intelligence, because we are yet again at a point where technology can be a very transformative driver.
What would you say are the key hurdles that might prevent you from reaching all of those goals?
Maybe the simplest way to describe it is that we see a tendency at the moment where, partly out of the uncertainty about the future, there is an increasing tendency to turn inwards. What used to be our neighbors are more often now our enemies. What used to be our partners are now our competitors. And yet we live in a 21st century global economy and also geopolitical reality where we depend on one another more than ever before. Not just in philosophical terms, but actually in very practical terms. COVID was a brutal reminder with the pandemic. Technology, we can have the most extraordinary digital economy and artificial intelligence, but if countries are not legislating and putting the right institutional capacities in place to deal with cybercrime, cyber terrorism, it could become an extraordinary threat to our safety.
You recently made your first trip to China since the pandemic. China has led the world in poverty reduction over the past decade. So what did you take from your visit?
I think, first of all, China has had to also make many short-term policy decisions to deal with the pandemic, the consequence of the pandemic, the shocks to international markets. And I think what was very interesting was to see how, by the end of 2024, a series of these public policy measures had worked relatively well. And China's economy, again achieved a 5% plus growth rate last year. So it is, in a sense, back on track from the point of view of having been severely disrupted. Perhaps beyond the extraordinary journey in terms of poverty eradication that China has accomplished over the last 3 to 4 decades, perhaps the most interesting thing to watch over the coming years is China perhaps one of the first economies in the world that has taken the green economy paradigm, these transitions and transformations, genuinely as the driver of the future economy of China.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, we'll have the latest from Texas as Donald Trump's proposed mass deportation plan gets underway on the US-Mexico border.
In the 18th century, a small number of products escaped from China and lit a touch paper in the West of excitement.
It's amazingly impressive because they were such incredibly talented artists.
When you talk about silk, with a value of 3 or 4 garments, you could buy a palace.
Art is traveling as a silent ambassador to spread the word about culture and civilization.
And welcome back. These are the headlines. 4 more Israeli hostages are released by Hamas in an unprecedented public event in Gaza as Israelis in Tel Aviv rejoice. Meanwhile, 200 Palestinian detainees are freed from Israeli prisons as part of the second exchange of the ceasefire agreement. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that he hopes that Europe and the United States will be involved in any talks about ending the conflict with Russia. His comments come after he said Vladimir Putin is aiming to manipulate Donald Trump. Russia's leader claimed on Friday that he was ready for negotiations and suggested meeting with the new US president. Zelensky has called it a ploy and says it will not succeed. Our correspondent Ross Cullen reports from Kiev.
The main thing that Volodymyr Zelensky is nervous about is the possibility that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin could meet to decide a bilateral peace deal between themselves, not involving Kiev, not involving European leaders, and that those two presidents could potentially impose a disadvantageous peace deal on Ukraine. That is a worst-case scenario for European leaders and for Volodymyr Zelensky. But we do need to pay attention to the possibility that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin could meet. They are scheduled to have a phone call at some point, according to the US president, very soon. And then, as we now know from the Russian leader, Moscow say they are also ready to meet, ready for negotiations. Now, where this could take place will be very interesting to watch. You might remember, Paul, in 2018, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin had a meeting, a summit during Mr. Trump's first term in office. That took place in Helsinki. There is no way that they could go back to Helsinki for this time around if they do agree the terms for a face-to-face meeting. Helsinki is an ally of Ukraine, and ever since Russia began its full-scale invasion in 2022, Finland has now joined NATO, and so it is extremely unlikely, you could almost say the chance is zero, that Vladimir Putin would want to negotiate an end to the war on NATO territory. So that is something that Volodymyr Zelensky absolutely wants, a seat at the table, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and ideally he would also like European leaders there for any possible peace talks. Now, just on him personally, it is his birthday today. He's the youngest president in Ukrainian history, turning 47, and right now he is hosting his Moldovan counterpart Maya Sandu for an official visit.
And Ukraine's military, meanwhile, Ross, says that Moscow has launched more missiles into the country. A terrible birthday present for the president. What more can you tell us about that?
Yes, I'll come to those specific attacks in just a minute, but in the last couple of hours, Paul, we have had confirmation that there has been a new drone attack in and around the second city of Ukraine, that is Kharkiv. We know that is only 30 kilometres from the Russian border, regularly targeted by Russia, and their water and electricity supplies in Kharkiv have been disrupted, and they are working to establish the number of casualties. They know there are casualties if they are wounded for now, or if there have also been some fatalities. What you mentioned as well, the earlier confirmation from the Ukrainian armed forces of overnight attacks Friday into Saturday. We had air raid alarms going off here on Friday night into the early hours of Saturday morning here as well, so there was a risk to Kiev, but overall 10 civilians were injured in those attacks. 61 drones were launched by Russia, 2 Kh-59-69 cruise missiles as well fired towards Ukraine. Both of those were shot down. Most of the drones didn't hit their targets, but yeah, 10 civilians confirmed injured as a result of those attacks. Paul?
That was Ross Cullen in Kiev. Our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova has the latest now from Moscow.
Well, indeed, we understand from the authorities in the Kherson region that the city of Alyashki has indeed come under the attack by the Ukrainian military, and according to the local officials, 3 civilians have died as a result. We also know from the local officials that this has been the largest scale attack using the banned cluster munitions. So they insist that Ukraine has flooded the city with scatterable high explosive anti-personnel landmines, and therefore there is still the threat of further threats to the civilian population, and local officials insist that they should not be leaving their houses because the process of demining of the city is ongoing. We're also hearing that the governor of the region has said that it is not the first time that the city is being attacked. On the 30th of December, the city has come under another attack by the Ukrainian side, which has been targeting the hospital, and as a result of that attack, the deputy chief doctor of this hospital was killed, and the head doctor was sent to Moscow for the recovery. Other attacks against the Russian regions do include the use of drones, and the Russian air defenses, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, have managed to repel those attacks. But again, those are the continuous attacks by the Ukrainian side against the Russian regions, and nobody is safe from that, although the Russian officials insist that they have managed to build a very strong system against the Ukrainian drones.
And Russia's defense ministry says that troops have fought their way into a strategically important eastern Ukrainian town. What can you tell us?
That's right. This is Velika Novoselyevka, and this is where, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, they have been making their gains. We understand that they have been pushing through in this direction for quite some time. Now, the very clear picture that we get from the local authorities is that some part of this city has already come under the Russian control, with the Ukrainian troops being blocked there, and the local officials have insisted that Ukraine has lost several hundred of troops in the western part of the city as the fighting has been taking place. But keep in mind that Moscow has been making gains on those directions all for the past months, and Moscow is saying that this is one of the latest levels of the Ukrainian defense in the region. So certainly it is a very important move for Moscow, and that also gives the Russian authorities a very upper hand when it comes to the possibility of negotiations, because Russian officials have all been maintaining that over the course of the past month they have been making gains, and that makes the Russian negotiating position, should there be any sort of negotiations with the United States or with Ukraine, much stronger. However, we understand that in the Kursk region, the Ukrainian military are still there, and when we hear about the developments on that front, the Russian officials say that they are liberating the Russian territory, but this is still an ongoing process.
Our Moscow correspondent Dasha Chernyshova. In other news, the US Department of Homeland Security has ordered a pause in several programs that allow immigrants to settle temporarily in the country. That's according to a report in the New York Times. It comes amid a range of new restrictions brought in by the Trump administration, prompting fears in migrant communities. Our correspondent Tony Waterman reports from Texas.
The first photographic evidence of President Donald Trump's mass deportation promise in action. His press secretary posting these photos on social media. showing people being escorted onto a military aircraft shackled at the ankles and waist. Video released from the Guatemalan government shows 2 flights arriving in the capital city. Trump officials say 538 people were arrested by immigration officials on Thursday, including some criminals.
When I got this information, I was appalled.
Meanwhile, the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, saying a raid overnight in his city was done without a warrant and that U.S. citizens were detained alongside 3 undocumented migrants.
One person showed their military veteran identification and was still questioned anyway. If we allow people to identify us or put us in categories of criminal or any other thing just by the way we look, then we're going back to a time that was very dangerous in this country, specifically for people that looked like me.
Federal immigration officials saying citizens are sometimes ID'd during their field work. The arrests and deportations, though, putting immigrant communities further on edge, especially after the Trump administration lifted a long-standing policy that barred arrests in and around schools and churches.
The police department or ICE can...
Javier Leyva has been a pastor at a church in Eagle Pass, Texas, right along the U.S.-Mexico border for the past 5 years.
Do you think that ICE agents would come to your church?
Well, if they have orders and if they suspect that somebody's undocumented, even if we're Christian, we have to follow the law and obey it, whether we like it or not.
Have you gotten a sense that some of your parishioners are going to stop coming to Mass because they're scared?
That's very possible. Or even go to the doctor. Or get their kids out of school.
That was the way they were raised.
Across town, a group of Eagle Pass locals meet up for their daily political breakfast.
The people who we don't want to have here are those who are criminal intent or criminal already did. And, yeah, they should be removed. But I don't see the mass deportations freaking people out, dividing up families.
We need to establish order. We cannot continue with this disorder that we're having right now.
What's not yet clear is where the line will be drawn. If deporting mostly criminals will satiate calls for mass deportations, or if the rest of the estimated 11 million people in the U.S. illegally will also be targeted. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Eagle Pass, Texas.
Mexico has reportedly refused to allow American military aircraft carrying those deported migrants to land in the country. It's understood 2 flights to Guatemala were carried out on Friday as part of Trump's immigration crackdown, but the mission to Mexico could not proceed. US and Mexican officials are yet to make formal comment on the matter. Meanwhile, Washington has ordered a freeze on new funding for almost all foreign aid. It follows an executive order by Donald Trump, which instructed a 90-day pause to review efficiency. The freeze makes exceptions for emergency food programs and military aid to Egypt and to Israel. It's not been confirmed yet if aid for Ukraine will be halted. Supporters and opponents of South Korea's embattled President Yoon Suk-yeol have held separate rallies in downtown Seoul. Crowds gathered to demand the immediate release of Yoon after the Seoul Central District Court denied the prosecutor's request for an extension of his arrest. Meanwhile, Yoon's critics called for his immediate indictment and for him to be impeached as soon as possible. Fresh weather warnings have been issued across the UK and Ireland in the wake of Storm Eowyn, which left 1 person dead and around 1 million without power. Wind gusts of up to 100 miles per hour were recorded on Friday amid new alerts for more wind, rain and snow. Meteorologists claim the storm is likely to be the strongest to hit the UK in at least a decade. It's the world's largest annual human migration. China's Spring Festival travel rush is now well underway, and as the Lunar New Year approaches, rail travel is the second most popular form of transport, behind cars, with one ticket clerk in Shanghai fast becoming an online sensation. Our correspondent Chao Feng explains.
Meet Liu Yuan, a ticket clerk at Shanghai Hongqiao Railway Station, with super speedy hands.
Look how fast her hands are moving. And what's even more impressive, she doesn't even use her mouse. I think my eyes are spinning just by watching her work.
Just business class, second class is sold out.
She's also fluent in English, able to provide service to international customers.
I would say she's the best. Because her service is very professional and it's very perfect.
Yu Yuan recently gained unexpected fame online, with videos showcasing her lightning-fast typing and fluent English going viral across social media platforms. Despite the attention, she remains remarkably calm in the face of her newfound popularity.
This is just part of my daily work, and I didn't expect to receive so much recognition and appreciation from so many netizens. I've been working for around 10 years, and we've also experienced large passenger flows. Back then, during peak times, you had to move quickly.
Yu Yuan says years back, during the Spring Festival travel rush, she was able to issue up to 1,500 tickets a day. But such speed is no longer a requirement. With self-servicing stations, digital tickets, and online ticket sales now commonly used in China. However, her job has now become more complex.
In the past, our counters were solely for ticket sales and refunds, but now you can see that we offer a one-stop service for a variety of requests. There weren't as many foreign travelers needing assistance back then. But since the visa policies were relaxed and more travelers have arrived, we have to communicate effectively with them.
A total of 9 billion domestic trips are expected for this year's Spring Festival travel rush. Transportation networks across the country are ready.
In a country like China, with the world's second largest economy and population, it's no surprise that exceptional talent emerges from even the most ordinary jobs. Like the saying goes, mastery lies with the people. Cao Chufeng, CGTN, Shanghai.
And the headlines again. 4 more Israeli hostages are released by Hamas in an unprecedented public event in Gaza as Israelis in Tel Aviv rejoice. Meanwhile, 200 Palestinian detainees are freed from Israeli prisons as part of the second exchange of the ceasefire agreement. And fear in migrant communities as Donald Trump's proposed mass deportation plan gets underway in the United States. That's the world today. Thank you very much for watching. There's more news at the top of the hour. Coming up next is the agenda with Juliette Mann. For now, though, from all the team in London. Bye-bye.